Thank you once again to Kate Brown for coming up with the challenge for this week. So we've got lots of different inputs to join together and lots of different calculations. So it's a really interesting problem to tackle. So this is the completed workflow. I'm just going to zoom it back in to 100% so that you're able to read all of the comments underneath each step. So we start off with our people data. So we've got IDs, information about their first name, last name, who their leader is, so like the leader ID there, and their location ID as well. So we start off by joining on the location ID. So our location data set is just doing the location ID and matching it up with a location. So if we do a join on location ID, then that's quite simple to just add on this location field. And then I've removed location ID from the join results, so both from the people table and from the location table. Next up, we're bringing in our leader information. So initially I made a mistake here and I definitely joined the ID here onto the ID of this field, which is why I have a left join here. I've just realized that I can change this to be an inner join and it's not going to affect anything. So we just need to make sure that our leader one is joining to our ID rather than the default that Prep does where it joins the ID onto the ID. So here we now have a list of all of our agents and their leaders associated with them, as well as their location. So that's what we've got to so far. So now we just want to do some formatting of those names. So create an agent name. So it's just the last name plus, in inverted commas, a comma, and then a space, and then plus the first name there. So that we get, for example, this one here, this Fleur Garnham becomes Garnham, comma, Fleur. Okay, and then we just remove those fields. And similarly, we do a similar thing for the leader name as well, just to put it in the right format there. Okay, rather than coming to this dummy step, I'm going to go down and look at the date dim table where we need to join that on. So this is our table that we get initially. So we have all of these month start dates going from 2021 to 2023. And we just want to, first of all, filter that to be just 2021. So if we go to the filter menu here, because it's a date, then we can select a range of dates, and then we can filter from this drop down. So it starts on the 1st of January 2021, and we can just make sure that that extends to the 1st of December. So I could change that, type in 12 there, change that to 2021. There you go. Or I could use a little calendar menu to select it myself. Okay, so that's all that I've done in this step here. And then in order to join this field onto my data about my agents, what I'm going to do is I need a field that is in common between the two tables in order to join them. But what I want to do is duplicate the information from each of the people table into a row for each month. So I'm just going to add on a dummy field. So my dummy field is just a calculated field where you have a 1 as the value. And I have that dummy field here and that dummy field here. I think Kate refers to it as a join field, but I like to call it a dummy field myself, just so that I know that it can be removed from my workflow later. Okay. So I join this together on the dummy field and you can see that our 135 records get multiplied by 12 to get this 1620. Okay, I'm keeping one of the dummy fields because I know that I'm going to need to use that later. So now that we have our date field, our month start date included in the data set here, we can then go on to look into joining in our monthly data. So from the other Excel sheet, we have one for each month of 2021. So we're going to go to the input step here and we're going to do a wildcard union. So when we click on the wildcard union, then we need to tell it the matching pattern. So we want to include which sheets, we want to include all of them, so we leave it blank. And then you just need to make sure that you hit this apply button, and we know that it's worked because we get this little plus symbol on our input table there. Okay, and then I've unticked file paths because they all come from the same Excel sheet, so that's not a particularly useful field to carry forwards. So if I have a look at this data, then I can see that I have information about my agent ID, the calls offered, not answered, and answered, the total duration that that agent has worked in that month, and then the sentiment scores from those calls, like the aggregated sentiment for that agent for that month. And then you can see that we get some repeat fields here. We get this offered, not answered, and answered. So clearly one of the tables in our union datasets, one of them has named it slightly differently. So in order to merge them, let's just show an example of how to do that. I'm going to pick up the offered field here and drag it over to my calls offered, and I just drop it on top of it to merge those two fields together. Okay, and that's what I've done in this step here. So I've merged together the three or the 6 fields, if you like, that need merging. And then I can create my month start date field out of this table names. So the first thing that's really cool to note is that with the table names, let me show you here so you believe me, if I just change the data type to a date, then it's automatically going to recognize each of those months as the correct month. But it's going to put a default year of 1900. So we just need to change it so that it becomes for 2021. So we do that part of it where we change it to a date. Then our calculated field looks like we wrap the whole thing in a date so it doesn't become a date time, but we use the date add function. And we use the year and we add on 121 years to the table names date. And then we have our month start date. Okay, now we can join this into our work stream that we've been working on, our main kind of data source that we're building up. So this is what our join looks like. First of all, it's easy to know we want to join the month start date to the month start date. But something that I definitely missed initially when I was building this flow was that I need to also have my ID equal to the agent ID because we need to make sure that obviously each agent is getting the information about themselves joined onto their row rather than having all of the information joined onto every single agent. Okay, so make sure that you didn't miss that. And then our final data set that we're bringing in is our goals data set. So let's take a look at that. So we've got our goals that we want our not answered percent to be less than 5 and our sentiment score to be greater than or equal to 0. So if we just take out the numeric value for each of that, so if I go into my calculated field here, I've just used a write function. You could have used some regex, but I wanted to keep it simple and just use a write, so just take the last character basically of each of those rows. Then we're adding on this dummy field before pivoting it so that we only have one row of data. So it's not going to change the number of rows of data at all. So we get our goals as our headers there and have our values down here at the bottom. And we have this dummy field there. I did initially try to do these 2 steps the other way around, but I found that if you don't have a field left over here, then Tableau Prep doesn't like it too much. So that's just a hint if you were struggling with that too. And then we can join on our dummy so that we have those targets, those goals associated with every single row. And we're nearly there. We can remove our dummy from both inputs there. And we have 4 calculations to do now. So the first one is the not answered rate. So that is defined as the calls not answered over the calls offered. And we're rounding that to 3 decimal places. So if we see here, for example, this ID 1, their not answered rate is 3.8%. So that doesn't seem too bad. Then if we come to our next calculation, then we're going to look at the total duration for that agent in that month over the number of calls that they answered. So that will give us the average duration of their calls, and we're rounding it to 0 places this time. So the average duration of the calls was 16 minutes for this first agent here, which seems fairly lengthy, but who knows? And then 2 more that we need to look at. We need to look at if the goals are met or not. So we want to know if the sentiment is greater than or equal to the sentiment score target. So that's just our sentiment field greater than or equal to our sentiment score greater than or equal to 0, because that is a 0, remember, in that field. So if we go and take a look at that, say for our true values, we can see that the sentiment for that is all greater than 0. Our false values are all less than 0. Okay, and then finally, we're checking our final target. So we need to multiply our not answered rate by 100 before comparing it to the not answered rate, answer percentage less than 5. Because of course this is a 5 here. We could have divided this one by 100 instead. Doesn't matter which way round we do it. But we can see that it's working when we see that our true values are all below 5% and our false values are all above. And that is our challenge, which was quite a lengthy challenge, but full of great challenging parts to exercise our Preppin skills. So thanks very much for watching, and thanks again to Kate Brown.